This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today, we have a truly exceptional guest whose extensive expertise spans planning, marketing, and data science across both global and local landscapes. He received his undergrad in materials engineering, then went on to get a master's of engineering at Rutgers and a master's of business administration at the University of Iowa. He's worked for massive names such as Gallup, SAB Miller, Microsoft, and eBay. Please welcome analytics consultant that helps companies build analytics teams and engagement with business partners, Ashish Singru. Welcome to the show, Ashish.
Hello. Good afternoon, Ryan. Great to meet you and great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to jump right in and I want to ask you our Q1. What is the one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
Yes. So I would say, and this is really something I have learned over the years, that when people get excited about using data, I think what they forget is before really getting into the data and playing with it, it's really important for them to be clear in their own minds as to what they are trying to solve, right? So data looks cool. It's cool to tell others that I'm using data to solve my problems, but make sure you are clear in your own mind about how you want to use data to solve problems. Because it's only going to be as good as the problem that needs the data to be solved. So that's one thing I would say to people who are excited about using data. To those who are not excited about using data, I think what I would say is that it's a great thing to have a very good intuition of your own, and we can never replace experience that you have already gained on your own area of work. But it'll be amazing if you just try using data once or twice to see how your intuition compares to what the data might tell. Yeah, it might tell you that it's matching, and then you should feel even better about yourself. But trust me, I mean, many times it'll surprise you and you will thank yourself for having tried it.
Yeah, I love the point that you're making to folks that may not be fully on board with using data to make every decision. And I think obviously this being a podcast for data folks, that population's probably small. But I think that there's still a really interesting point, and that is no matter where we're at using data, there's almost always a place where we can effectively use it a little bit more. And even as somebody that helps other companies use data more frequently to make better decisions, there are still times within my own business or my personal life where I'm like, oh, well, I think I know what the right call is here. And I think there's just always an opportunity to do a little bit better of a job modeling something out, going in, seeing if you can find some information. And invariably, I find my intuition was wrong. And I also find that by getting the ideas out of my head, because in my head, there's all sorts of heuristics that happen. And I'm like, oh, I care more about this than that. But okay, well, how much? What's the cost? There are all of these little pieces of the puzzle that our human brains are just not really engineered to do a good job of. We don't do a good job with risk, and we don't do a good job of really active thinking. We tend to just shortcut to heuristics. We tend to kind of misestimate risks. So I think that even for the data folks listening here, that's a great point. The other point that you made was around making sure that you understand the business context of the question that you're trying to answer. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and this one probably is really targeted at the data community, right? Because I think what happens to us is that often we are so much in love with the techniques that we want to unleash on the data that is available to us, that we are spending actually a lot of time thinking, okay, purely in terms of those variables that are in our hand and how we're going to sort of build models to explain how one variable affects the other one and so on, that we're often missing the point around, okay, what is the business model, or what is the mental model of the decision maker who is going to benefit from your work. So what I mean is that, you know, you need to really understand the business in terms of knowing how in the real world, regardless of what metrics or numbers you have, things affect each other, and then how that whole system works, right? Because you may see a strong mathematical correlation or causation in your data between two things, but in the real world that means nothing. So you need to really understand how the real system works in terms of, inputs, outputs, the feedback loops, and then also the decision makers. How they think, how they operate, because ultimately they have to buy into whatever you give them, and then they have to use it. So you have to also understand where they're coming from in terms of how they currently do things, right? That's what I meant by business context, both the people side of it and also the business black box, how it operates.
I think that one of the concepts that you just kind of brushed up against is one that we haven't had a ton of time to explore on the podcast. So you use the term mental model.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more what you meant when you said mental model.
Yes. So essentially, mental models are what decision makers are used to thinking of the way they think stuff happens, right? So uh, let's say you are a consultant, and I think you probably can relate to it, since you also do consulting. I think when you walk in and you're getting a brief from your client, you're probably able to sense uh, how they believe the world operates in their business, and how they think variables tie to each other. Now, they may be hiring you for two things, one or two things. Um, Maybe to reconfirm how their mental model works and how data can actually confirm or reaffirm to them that yes, their mental model is correct. Or they are like open-minded and they want to actually know that is their mental model either outdated, or maybe there's a blind spot in their mental model that they want to address, right? And it's your responsibility as the analytics person, data person, to help them either way, whichever sort of one that either the data is telling you, or you want to solve. So I think as part of that, um, it's really really important before you jump into the data and purely look at the math aspect of it, to know where the mental model of the decision maker is coming from, because it's when you start interpreting the data, when you start telling the story on the data, you have to be aware of that. Otherwise, there will be, a, a, a a challenge in communicating what you found to how your client might interpret it or receive it. So that's something that I've seen many times when the analyst and the client are in completely different headspaces in terms of how things work. There's a lot of challenge in actually even convincing them of a really good analytical solution.
Yeah. I love this line of thinking. Um it was a couple years ago that I was first introduced to kind of the formal structure of, design thinking. And, one of the first things that I read about was this concept of a mental model. And they talk about how consumers generally misuse products or don't understand products based on that mental model. So, for example, the person that stands at a crosswalk and just keeps smashing the crosswalk button doesn't understand the mental model of you pressed it once, it started a timer. So they've started changing those crosswalks So the buttons don't break where it has a light that turns on when the button's been pressed, or it makes a noise when the button's been pressed to kind of show that person, hey, you pressed the button, I heard you, here you go. Um, or similarly, like with an air conditioner, right? Like the air conditioner in my house, the compressor's on or it's off. So if I want to cool my room down faster, if I crank the temperature down to 60, it's going to work at the same speed as if I set it to 70. However, the air conditioner in my car blends cold air from outside and hot air from the engine and, all these different things. You actually can change how quickly things cool down. But unless we really, really understand how the system works, we can get ourselves into all these problems. And I love how you tied that to the business. And you really kind of highlighted two areas where this design thinking can help. So, on the one side, there's the decision maker's mental model of the actual decision, the business situation. Then there's also the mental model of how whatever we build, reporting, infrastructure, whatever, how does that work? How can they get information out of that? And you're so right. I would say probably over half of the analytics projects that I've seen go sideways because of a breakdown in this mental modeling. So, what are some recommendations that you have for a data person to better understand the mental model of business problems and also the mental model of how a lot of their report consumers think about the things they build?
Sure, yeah, and I'll give you a very simple, just a real world example, just to kind of make it real in terms of these what these mental models could be. So, having worked in the e-commerce industry for quite some time recently, I remember like one experience where the decision maker, in terms of how they thought about the role of weather in influencing sales of their products. Uh, and I think from the decision maker's perspective, weather was just noise. It's not a real thing. When you can't explain any fluctuation in your sales, your team will say, probably it was the weather. The weather caused it, right? So they always thought of weather as not a real factor, but as a noise that can create randomness. And I remember, like me and my team, when we worked on the problem and we worked on the data, we found that actually weather was not noise. It had a very logical, clear signal that was influencing not only the behavior of consumers, but then many times it also affects logistics in an e-commerce situation. And so initially, when we were trying to convince the decision maker, we were not able to understand why they're not able to agree, because they had that, I think, blind spot. And then I think over time, then we figured out that okay, this is how they think. That they think of weather as noise. We think of it as a real thing. Okay, how do you then come back to them and explain uh, that that difference, and convince them that they should start thinking of weather as a real thing, and then plan some strategy around dealing with weather things. We can't change the weather, but you can actually plan around it, right? So I think that's how sort of I would describe the mental model. So I think I would say that if you're working with a decision maker that you never worked with before, obviously you don't know their mental model. So you have to kind of iteratively, work with them. But what you have to do as an analytics person is that whenever you have those meetings, you need to really ask those questions that will let you probe the mental models, because oftentimes the mental models would not be something that people would explicitly tell you. Those are implicit. And when you're kind of having those Q&A in the beginning of the project, you can then see that, okay, this could be either a bias or a hypothesis or a blind spot, for lack of a better term, that could be different from the way uh, you know we may approach the model. So I think you have to do it on your own. Once you obviously get to know the mental models, then you can plan your work accordingly and communication accordingly. But in the beginning, you have to be listening for those things, because those are usually implicit and not explicit in the brief that you may get from your client, or when the client speaks to you.
Yeah. It's impossible when talking to you to not see kind of the strength of the engineering background. and how it's giving you, I would say, like a solid foundation and not just design thinking, but also in systems thinking and mechanics. I want to dig into that a little bit more. Like having such a substantial engineering background, what are some of the skills and the lessons that you learned there that you bring into the analytics space that you think listeners that don't have that background might get something out of?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I think engineering education or training, from my experiences that go back, I think helps you in two different ways. So one is the kind of theoretical side of engineering training, where you learn more about the math aspects of it, and you learn about variables and models and equations, and that's where you learn a lot about cause and effect. You learn to start thinking from first principles about uh, any kind of root cause analysis. So you try to kind of work uh, your way up to explain something, rather than start with a specific kind of train of thought. So you just kind of do it more organically. So I think that kind of helps you a lot when it comes to analytics. That's one aspect. Just kind of learning from scratch how one thing affects the other. The other aspect is the experimental side, or the hands-on side of engineering, like whether you work in a factory, or you work in a laboratory and do stuff as an engineer. I think there what you learn is a lot of the trial and error, because often what happens is you learn one set of things in the theoretical side, but then not everything applies in practice, right? And there you learn more of the trial and error, the iteration aspect. You learn some of that humbleness around, hey, what I thought would work is not going to work. Let me try it a different way. And I think as an engineer, when you kind of learn both the theoretical side and the experimental side, and let's say you come into the world of data and analytics, I think both of them help you each in a different way. One kind of helps you, just kind of making sense of the data, but then the other one helps you just kind of messing around and tinkering with different techniques and seeing which one really works well.
I love that. One of the things you mentioned there was a root cause analysis. And if I think about a lot of the requests that I get on an analytics front, a lot of them have to do with that question of why. Why did this happen? So I know that there are a lot of different frameworks, particularly within engineering space, for how to think about, the interdependence of different elements in a system. But if you can teach me and the listeners a little bit about, a framework that you like for how you can go through and really dig into like what caused the problem.
Yes, absolutely. So I think, one of and this is like way before the age of neural networks and AI. When we first learned about root cause analysis, I remember what really, worked for me was the fishbone diagram approach, and I believe it came back then from Japanese manufacturing, where they had a lot of focus on quality and total quality management and zero defects. And every time there would be a defect, I think in Japanese factories, they would have this very rigorous root cause analysis, right? So they came out with a methodology which then went out into universities and so on. So I think it's called the fishbone diagram. It looks like the bones of the fish. And you know what it helps you with is really figure out how many different sets of variables can potentially be primary causes and which ones are secondary causes, because and that's very important to know, because let's say you are uh, on a very tight timeline, and you want to tell somebody in a leadership role wants you to tell them quickly what could be happening. You can't be spending like a month going into the perfect details of all the things that are responsible. You need to first identify those primary factors. And so what I have actually benefited from is to first focus on what could be the primary factors, providing business folks a quick preview that, hey, like at the first level, we are seeing like these things standing out as reasons for some drop in sales or a drop in customer satisfaction or whatever. And then you know that's a good opportunity for them to ask a few more questions before I jump into a deeper analysis of secondary or tertiary factors. Because when it comes to secondary and tertiary factors that may be causing the problem, some might be actually material, some might not be material, some might be actionable, some might not be actionable. So it's really important to first kind of just look at the primary factors. Each of them might be like a bit of a black box at this point, but still it helps you start kind of figuring out how deep do you want to go to analyze how worth it is to go to 100,000 feet versus 50,000 feet, because ultimately it's all about being practical, right? When you're doing any kind of root cause analysis. So yeah, so that's the kind of approach that I have used in the past. The using starting with the fishbone diagram, identifying the primaries and secondaries. Uh, after I've had a chance to understand what's actionable and not.
I actually also have a little bit of experience with, kind of that kind of Japanese school of defect management and a lot of the analytics around that. So obviously, Toyota
Mhm.
was pretty foundational in being able to build a lot of that stuff, the Toyota production system. And, it reminds me of Office Space with the TPS reports.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember those. Yeah.
I think one of the tools that it brings to mind is in any type of, obviously manufacturing and production and assembly and things like that are the place where, you know, these analyses find their home, but it's actually really, really interesting to start applying it to kind of non-manufacturing schools. So, for example, one that I did was looking at a website and kind of like what are the types of things that cause someone to bounce off of a website. So you imagine you have all of these people coming in checking out your website, there's all these different pages that they go to, and then they navigate around your site, and then there are certain pages that people just don't like, and they get the information they need or whatever, but they're bouncing off of that site. And so what we did was we put together a Pareto chart, which for those people who are not familiar with kind of the Toyota production system or, kind of similar schools of thought, is a very, very specific combination of a bar and a line chart that allows you to look at what is the most common defect or what is the most common place that people are leaving from or what is the most common failure or complaint or whatever it is. And they take a little bit of time to read and they can sometimes be a little bit finicky to make, but I've found them as this kind of very relentless approach to destroying whatever failures it is in the system that you're looking for. And what's cool is as soon as you eliminate one failure, it automatically refocuses and is like, here's what you should focus on now. And no matter what the magnitude of the failures are, because like if you think about Japanese manufacturing, their manufacturing is superlative, right? So like they just keep cranking and cranking and cranking, and it's that kind of mentality. And so it's cool kind of like looking at the intersection of data and how those things can kind of, you know, drive that performance, right? Like without some of the reporting and the analytics tools that came out of that system, I'm not sure that it would have had as much success. It really puts the finger on the pulse of what can be going wrong at a given time.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very interesting. I think just kind of hearing from you, from your experiences, and I think today, now that we have these neural networks that AI has given,
Mm.
uh, and they kind of can show you how all these different variables kind of work together. It's become much easier in any line of business, not just manufacturing, but even a service business or a dot-com business, to identify like critical paths of failure, right? So it can probably highlight for you that one path which is kind of causing the most breakdowns, like whether it's your user who is coming to the website and if they go down this path, then they're kind of doomed to leave versus if they go on the other path. So it's helping people design the customer experiences and customer journeys in a better way, hopefully, by using kind of like the identification of critical paths of failure. Uh, because customers can interact with your business in multiple ways, and if you find the most flawed way, you can probably eliminate it or improve it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're very right. One of the things that I talk on the podcast about a lot is kind of right sizing the magnitude of use cases, in particular for like generative AI. Um, and I say right sizing, meaningfully, right? I don't mean that to be like, oh, well, right sizing means small. Like it's not. Like generative AI is world changing, and I'm super excited over the coming months and years to see how it grows and improves. But one of the technologies for people, for listeners that may not be familiar, that um, large language models, which is essentially what ChatGPT and all these other things are, is a type of neural net interfaced with a couple other different pieces of the puzzle. And just kind of like plain neural nets without the transformer, without the large language model, this is like a perfect use case for that particular tool. So one of the things I love talking about on the podcast is when, you know, AI has definitely captured the public's imagination, but there are all of these other like really cool tools that are out there, like kind of more traditional neural nets, or, some of the other, more traditional machine learning algorithms that can be really, really powerful. And so I love always calling out a great use case when I hear one. That's an absolutely perfect example.
At the risk of sounding like, a bit dated, I would say that many of us who got into this industry more than 2 decades ago, I think it's our responsibility to keep reminding people of some of those simpler, older techniques that still work. In addition to, because everybody's focused on AI, obviously, but there's still a lot of goodness from what the way we used to do stuff 2 decades ago. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, the overarching theme of this discussion is that it's an and versus an or. There's nothing wrong with large language models, quite the opposite. Like, I can't think of something that has had as much impact as these tools since the proliferation of a personal computer. That being said, they have a couple properties that, number one being, if you use somebody else's large language model, you're feeding information into it that you may or may not want to do so. Number two, if you're going to make your own, they are very large and very costly and very complicated to do with any degree of return. And number three, as of right now, they have, compared to all the other things that are out there, like fairly narrow set of use cases. Now that swath is growing every day, and it would be very silly to not stay abreast of that, and to kind of continue watching for the new things that are coming out with it. But it's really an and, like looking at like, okay, there are all of these other tools that are phenomenal at solving all of these other use cases. And I think the big point that I like to make is that to go out and to like build, much more traditional, like smaller neural network, or a random forest, or k-means clustering algorithm, or like some of these other tools that are out there, that can be spun up in a couple hours,
yes.
right? And you can do that on, the computing power of a Chromebook. So some of these tools are super lightweight and get unbelievable results. And so I just like to make sure that everybody's aware of them. And it sounds like exactly what you're saying as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ryan. And I'll just add one more point there, that I think a lot of the benefits you get from using some of these other tools, like the k-means clustering, let's say for an example, is you can actually customize those techniques on your business case and the nature of your data set. Um, I think something like ChatGPT or LLM type tools, yes, they provide you convenience because all you have to do is to write a prompt and then there's a sea of information coming at you. But many times, like, where that information is coming from is a black box to you. There might be some biases in that data that's creating that output, which you will not be aware of, especially if you're using an external LLM. And so there's a risk that you might actually be walking away with information that may not strictly apply to your context. Whereas if you
Yeah.
apply your own techniques, like using some of these older statistical tools that's out there, you may get a more accurate view on your business because you would have a cleaner data set. You would probably have addressed some of the peculiarities of your business when you spec out the equations and all that. So I think, yeah, I mean, there's definitely value. There's convenience, there's accuracy, there is cost, there's time. You need to consider everything, but there's a lot of goodness in these techniques.
I want to change gears a little bit. Looking at kind of the story of your career, we've touched on a couple key elements that really influence the way that you think about data and work with data. One of the things that we haven't gotten to touch on yet is that you spent a large portion of your life and career working in India and now work in the United States. I wanted to ask you kind of two questions about that. One, what are some of the differences, certainly in the business landscape, but more particularly in the data and technology landscape in India versus the United States? And then number two, I think it would be fair to say that the Indian economy has done a really phenomenal job of providing technical education to some of the people there. So there's been this massive proliferation of people acquiring technical and data and computer science skills in India. And so there are a lot of companies that are kind of trying to leverage all that talent that's there. I wonder if you have any advice for what are some of the best ways that people can go about doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I have actually a lot of experience just hiring large teams and training them and making them impactful. As data scientists and analysts and so on out of India. So, I would say that first of all, yes, you're absolutely right that there's a rich tradition of technical and engineering education. I mean, I was a product of that myself, and people are coming out of that with a lot of really good technical skills. Uh, at the same time, I would say that having gone through the similar education system back then, there is a tendency to focus more on the scientific or mathematical elegance of all the education that you get. Like, hey, like you learn certain techniques in your computer science classes or mathematics classes or stats classes, and you want to, you feel that, okay, the more amazingly I can execute on those techniques, the more I'm contributing or adding value. And often, like when people are coming into a business context, in India, I've seen like they tend to underestimate the initial phase in which they need to really ask contextual questions, understand why the business is looking for an answer on this particular topic. They don't do enough Q&A with business users. I think they take it more as, hey, this is something that uh, just needs to be done, right? No questions asked. And that's more of a societal, hierarchical society kind of thing where people will tend to take stuff that it's coming from more senior level and just do it. And that's more of an Asian or maybe Indian sort of a society trait. And I think what we are doing there is that the leaders now are very much aware of this limitation in the way people approach data and solving problems with data. And what I did was to provide a lot of business context to these teams I was building and hiring, multiple ways, right? Make sure that every week they spend some time, let's say they're working with people outside of India, they overlap in some of the business meetings and just sit in the business meetings listening to how business people talk about the problem in the business language, and the questions they ask there, so that way they understand some of that context. To really kind of, when we do the onboarding, make sure that people get a chance to be the customer. So like, let's say in the e-commerce business, tell them, hey, you open an account on our site, you try to buy something or sell something, like at eBay we would do that. And that way they really get to understand how the business works, how the customer thinks, how the business leaders think. And then when they're working on the data, they have that information behind them. So what I would advise anybody who is trying to leverage this amazing talent pool that is there is, make sure that you onboard people uh, with sufficient business context wrapped around them as they start working with you, because the technical skills are good, the communication skills are good and getting better. It's just that business context can can dramatically differ between where they might be and where you might be. You know, and that's an area where I think I've seen, like, since I've worked in the U.S. as well for a very long time, I can see that uh, here there is a lot more of that Socratic method of, questioning and Q&A, and trying to figure out why we are doing something, and I think that really helps save time, save effort, and hit the bullseye in terms of the solution.
Yeah, I think it would be, obviously we're kind of generalizing about large countries, right? Like the US is large and India is massive, right? The number of people and all that stuff. But I think America definitely skews a little bit in the opposite direction, right? As far as like focusing very heavily on, kind of the business side of the equation as opposed to the kind of uber technical. And so it strikes me that the type of leadership that can bridge that gap and like provide good technical context to the business users and good business context to the technical users in order to build like a good hybrid team is also the exact same type of leadership that's kinda necessary when you're working with, like, a centralized analytics function, which is, like, typically very technical and, that's kind of their background, science, computer science, math, things like that, as opposed to kinda like your MBA types that are out there, like, doing business or, marketing, sales, whatever it is. So, because you have that experience bridging the gap between those kind of 2 different cultures that are focusing, a little more technically and a little more business oriented, what are maybe some recommendations that you have coming out of that experience that whether someone's looking to build a hybrid team or not, that kind of balancing act between the technical and the business has to happen everywhere. So what are some recommendations you have for folks like that?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And it's interesting topic, because in the past, and this is when I was working in the US, we had actually tried a model in my one of my companies, where there was like a role called the business advisor, uh, and then there was the more technical analytics role, right? And the business advisors were more of the MBA profile folks, whose job was to kind of be that translator and interpreter between the analytics team and the other team. And I think what we realize is that often uh, the end users want an agile analytics team, and having these two roles kind of being separate was slowing things down and making things slower. And then we had to sort of move towards a different model, where we said, okay, we need to not have hybrid in the sense of two distinct roles, but we need to actually change our hiring strategy a little bit to hire people who may have more of a blend of the two skills, and then using them on different projects in different ways, depending on whether the project required more technical or more of the business background. And then I think the challenge there is to find those people, obviously, right? Like, who have that right kind of blend of the two things. One thing that I've tried successfully, uh, when I was building teams for eBay, was to change the interviewing approach significantly, because interviewing was much more technical in nature, and then we added more behavioral interviews. And what we found is that we don't need to really hire an MBA who will just magically understand the business. Even people without an MBA, with an undergraduate degree, in could be engineering, could be statistics, were able to actually, they had the potential to intuitively understand business situations, and we were very successful in hiring such people, and getting them onboarded to be those hybrid persons. So I would say to people that let's not put people in strict boxes, that this person is technical because of their background, this person is business because of their background. I think you can definitely find people who come with business background, and they come with a bachelor's degree in business, and you'll find out they can do really well with data. And you can find people who come with a technical background, who you'll find can actually do very well with a business context. So figure out a hiring strategy, or use your referrals in such a way that you get that mix. Because my experience, I think companies have struggled with creating those distinct boxes of roles, which it slows things down to a great extent. Maybe the large consulting firms do it better, but in-house teams do better when they are more agile.
I experienced kind of a similar thing, right? So that this problem that you talk about of trying to find the people that either have the skill set and I don't know about it, or even more difficult to find is have the potential. And either they don't know or we don't know or we both don't know. So obviously, there are a lot of people in data and analytics who have had a much longer career than I have so far. But I do think that I was kind of in the marketplace for a bit of a revolution that happened as far as, the capabilities of self-service. So kind of this idea of, okay, well, if we want to use data, company data to answer hard business questions, no longer do we need to have like only, a team of data engineers and database administrators and blah, 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 all these things. A lot of these new tools came out that allowed citizen developers of kind of a lot of different flavors to get involved in, empowering their decisions using data. And one of the things that we found was that there were all of these, diamonds in the rough, needles in the haystack, whatever you want to call them, hidden throughout all different parts of the organization. Like there would be like people in marketing and sales and, operations and like all different parts of a business that you would start putting some of this stuff in front of them and their eyes would light up and they would love it. And then they'd come back 2 weeks later and be like, look what I built. And you're like, holy cow. So I think that advice is right. Admittedly, it's not super scalable to just say, hey, get to know every single person on a super intimate basis and make sure that they're apprised of all of their different available options and test them on all of them, right? I get it. But yeah, I think that you're right. Like people have all sorts of crazy capabilities and talents that we may not know about. If you take a chance to get to know those, right? You That's good for business. That's a good thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you said it well, and I think uh, as more and more tools become available, you will find these people more and more, who are coming out of the woodwork and embracing that. I think I love the term citizen developer, but like a citizen data scientist or citizen data engineer, you'll see more of those as technology makes it more accessible for everyone to interact with these tools. I mean, 20 years ago, all this was a black box to most business people, so they either were ignorant or they were scared of it. And now it's different, right? So
It is. Yeah. Hopefully for the best.
yes, yes.
To the end of getting to know people better, I want to get to know you a little bit better. So, we obviously know that you're smart, and we got to learn a little bit of, your background and experience. Help us paint the rest of the picture. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it might sound funny, but when I was in middle school, all I wanted to do was to become a journalist. And at that time, I didn't realize, like, okay, why is that thing the first thing coming to my mind? But like later on, I realized that I'm curious about people. I love understanding people. And later on, like, I just sort of didn't become a journalist, but I do love to write. So whenever I've written, I think the feedback I get is, yeah, you write well, you should do it more. It's just a matter of like investing the time and doing it. I did write a chapter in a book, so that was enjoyable to write. But yeah, I love people, and I also love animals actually. So right from a younger age, I was curious about animals, and then talking about the animal side of things, like I realized, over the years that hey, uh, you can't like just go easily and see a tiger or see an elephant and learn more about them, every day. So my interest naturally moved towards birds. So over the years, I've become a very avid bird watcher, and I spend a lot of time like going out, uh, seeing birds, identifying them, but more than that, like just observing their behaviors. And trust me, I've learned a lot from birds. I mean, it's an amazing type of living thing we have, and it inspires me a lot in many ways in terms of little things that you can learn from them. So that's the animal side. On the people side, I think the way I've developed that passion is in multiple ways. I would say travel and see places to learn about history. I'm a huge history buff, so want to learn about places. I read history books as well, but just traveling to a place where there is a old monument or some relics. I mean, just kind of gives me a lot of satisfaction to feel like I have had some interaction with people that I'm curious about. I also just draw a lot of energy meeting new people. So whenever I get a chance, I love to go to conferences. I speak frequently at conferences because every time I go within the analytics community, I get to meet a wide range of people. Today, I'm meeting you, and so yeah, I think I try to kind of mix my professional interests with my personal interests, but it's mostly about getting to know more about people, birds, what we can learn from all this. It gives me a lot of satisfaction and joy.
Yeah, I love that. I think, combining kind of the personal and some of the technical stuff that we've talked about, it's interesting. I think a lot of the research in AI, at least initially, was kind of like, hey, we're just going to try a lot of different stuff out and create a lot of these structures. And what I think has actually emerged really interestingly is we use what we know about human psychology and then try to make some sort of technical analog. We're literally trying to digitally recreate the things which we see
Yeah.
in the real world. And I think that you're absolutely right. Like, there are so many times where you can go and you can look and observe, whether it's history and humans and animals or nature, and there's so much to be learned. I'm trying to get better at this as I get a little bit older, but to kind of quiet my mind and to actually see what's in front of me. Whether it's something like birds or, learning about the history of things that have happened in the past. There's just so many great lessons. I absolutely love that. That's definitely something for me to take away from this. Hopefully the listeners too.
Yeah, I know. I tell any younger person nowadays that make sure you have some hobbies that take you away from screens. I mean, screens are important. I think we all need them for a life, but always have some hobbies that take you away, because you can have just more and more screens as we go ahead. But got to make sure you spend some meaningful time away from it as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't second that message more. Like, my wife and friends all make fun of me. I'm like the hobby guy. Like, I just am constantly like figuring out something new. Like, um I learned how to do them a little while ago, but I'm recently trying to get back and get a little bit faster with the Rubik's cube or photography or getting out. And I am with you, like doing things with your hands or out in nature, or just like, the screens are amazing. They provide my living, but there's a lot of life that is not connected to one. So that's great advice.
And for the benefit of your viewers, I think in case they don't know, I think I saw in one of your earlier podcasts you talked about your love for skydiving, and that was so cool.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, that's going into nature at the extreme, and really admire that passion. Yeah,
The skydiving is one that it feels like it's a little bit out there, so I try not to mention it too much. People, will think that I'm a bit of a weirdo, but I did it once as kind of like a bucket list thing. I had kind of just gotten out of college and I had just started my career, so I had a job, I had a little bit of money in my pocket, and I didn't have a whole lot of bills yet. And I was over at my buddy's house and we saw parachutes coming down. We didn't even know it, but we were like right near a municipal airport that ran skydiving. I was like, let's go. Let's do it today. Because in the back of my head, my biggest fear was heights. That's why it was on the bucket list, was because I wanted to get over the fear. And we did it, and I hadn't even landed from that first jump. And I was like, I need this every day. And I chased it for a lot of years. um, it's an absolute blast, right? I strongly recommend at least doing one skydive for everybody out there. It is much safer than driving, and it's one of the coolest things you can do. So 10 out of 10 recommend. Thanks for bringing that up. Now, if anybody liked anything that you had to say or wants to learn a little bit more about something, what's the best way to reach out and connect with you?
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my LinkedIn profile is a very convenient way to reach me, and then I can take it from there with them in terms of interacting further via email or other means. But yeah, I think you can start there. And if they want to learn a little bit about a bit more about my work, my LinkedIn profile also has some of my past conference presentations or writings, so they can go there as well.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Ashish, this has been an extremely enjoyable hour for me. I feel like we got to cover a couple of topics that we haven't gotten to talk about on the podcast yet, and that really helped to kind of like provide a more rich understanding and bringing kind of new outside fields into the mentality of generating data and analytics for people. So I can't thank you enough for bringing your experience and taking the time to share it with me and with the listeners.
Yeah, and I love your approach to the areas you explore with your guests. I think it's very innovative. I would love to sort of keep hearing your podcast with others and learn from them. And for your viewers, yeah, please do tell your friends to listen more to Ryan's. I think there's some good stuff going on here. So thank you, Ryan.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Ashish. Yeah, that's a perfect dovetail. Do exactly what he said. Tell your friends, give us a like, give us a subscribe, make sure to write us a rating, hopefully a good one. It definitely helps get it out there to other people. So, Ashish, I want to thank you again. And this has been another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Thanks for listening. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.